Well, hello, America. This is Commander Al Palmer, United States Navy retired, and I'm your host for Stars and Stripes. And it's a great pleasure having you back with us today as we examine some of the issues that are facing our armed forces today and what we can do to find ways to keep our forces strong, keep meritocracy at the top of our list of things we need to have for our war fighters, and concentrate on solid leadership and accountability to keep our forces able to function. So to do that today, I'm proud to say on this Constitution Day, by the way, that we're happy to have two really esteemed guests with us. The first is Bill Scott, who's an author. He's been very instrumental in being a author of over 2,500 articles that have appeared in the magazines, most notably the one that he worked for 22 years, which was Aviation Week and Space Technology. One of my favorites when I was a young aviator. We couldn't wait for it to come out to find what was really happening in the aircraft that we were flying. And Bill, it's a great pleasure, sir, to have you with us today. And also Lieutenant
Thank you.
General Tom McInerney. He was a great fighter pilot. He's a leader across all aspects of leadership in the Air Force. And he's got an illustrious career. And so, Tom, sir, it's great to have you with us here today, too. But I will tell you, before we even get on to any of this, we all share one thing very much in common. We all worked with or served under Brigadier General Robert F. Titus, known affectionately by the folks he flew with as Earthquake. And I suspect you're probably wondering where that name comes from. Well, probably because General Titus, whoever he talked to, whoever he worked with, he usually ended up shaking up in some way. Either it was positive or sometimes a little negative. But what I loved about serving with him was he always demanded that we did the best we could, and he rewarded us for it when we did it. When he did it, he'd kick us in the rear end a little bit. So we're here to talk about that today in Bill's book called Earthquake. And so with that, Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you to lead us into this discussion about one of America's great fighter pilots and heroes, Bob Titus.
Thank you, Al. I was sort of drafted about a year ago to capture Bob Titus's story, and it was an honor to do so, believe me, because he did have quite an illustrious career. 32 years he served in uniform, and he started in the Army, of all things, and retired from the Air Force 32 years later. But on his 18th birthday, he joined the Army, became a paratrooper, got his wings, and he was ready to jump into Japan when World War II ended. Well, the Army didn't need quite as many people at that point, so he and many others mustered out, and he went back to school at Virginia Tech. So I was there for about 2 years, and in the spring of 1948, he was walking across campus, and there was a Air Force recruiter had a table set up, and this guy said, "Hey, you can go fly airplanes." So he decided that was going to be a lot more attractive career move than being a mining engineer. So he left Virginia Tech, joined the new Air Force there, and went to pilot training. He really wanted to fly at that time P-51 Mustangs, but when he got through pilot training, did well there, they said he was too tall. And if you were too tall to fly fighters, he had to go to bombers. So he did. He was checked out in the B-25 Mitchell, but eventually wrangled his way into the then called F-51 Mustang. And about the time the Korean War broke out, he had enough time. He was sent right over there and became a fighter pilot, flying missions in the P-51. And he flew 101 missions in the Korean War, both in the F-51 and the F-86, the jet. And at one point, he did get shot down, and he had to bail out of that F-51 at a very low altitude. Thankfully, he had that parachute training, didn't get hurt, hit the ground in no man's land between the two warring forces here. Well, as soon as he hit the ground, he sees, in his words, guys in quilted pajamas coming at him. And those guys had semi-automatic weapons or fully automatic. He had a little pea shooter revolver. He jumped into a crater there and said, "Oh, this is not going to work out well." Then he hears an American voice say, "Keep your head down and crawl this way." He was close to a Marine bunker. So he did exactly that. The Marines chased off the bad guy, and he lived to fight another day. So if we fast forward, after he left Korea, he was assigned to a unit ferrying jets, F-86s and F-84s, across the North Atlantic to NATO bases in Europe. And it wasn't trivial in those days. They lost enough
Yeah.
pilots, and it was considered a hazardous enough mission that after 10 of those crossings, the pilots were given an air medal. Well, after that, he, he was assigned to Edwards Air Force Base, went through Air Force Test Pilot School there, and then graduated class 54B, and then moved down the street and joined a cadre of soon to be legendary test pilots that brought the Century Series fighters online. And he flight tested every single one of them: F-100, the F-102 Delta Dart or Delta Dagger, the F-104 Starfighter, F-105 Thunder Chief, and the F-106 Delta Dart, plus a host of other ones. But one of his most unique test programs was called the F-100 Zero Launch System. And here they put a fighter like you see there, the F-100, on a rail, mounted on a trailer, and they would tip this thing up about 20 degrees, and then they'd put a 130,000-pound rocket booster. They'd mount it right there on the center line. And in
JADO,
Bob's terms, you would crawl into the cockpit, crank it up, go to afterburner, pull a switch that was on the front edge of the throttle, and off you go, in his words. He said, "You accelerate from 0 to 275 miles per hour in 4 seconds, and the rocket booster falls off," or it was supposed to be. And the whole concept at the time was being able to disperse American fighters around the country, launch them from about anywhere. The program really didn't go anywhere for a number of good logistical reasons. Well, after that program ended, Bob was tasked with finding a mission for a couple of two-seat F-100s, and he came up with what they called Operation Julius Caesar, and that was to demonstrate that fighters could be flown nonstop over the North Pole. So he, with Brigadier General Charles Blair and 2 backseat pilots, flew a couple of two-seat F-100s from England to Alaska, 9 hours, 3 in-flight refuelings. And that was where he picked up yet another Distinguished Flying Cross.
Yep.
Then the Air Force sent him to the University of Chicago to get a master's in business administration degree, and he subsequently flew F-105 Thunder Chief fighters, or THUDs, in Europe, and that was a tactical nuclear mission. They were setting alert with a small nuke strapped to their 105. He came back to the States, was assigned to Air Force Tactical Air Command, and General Gordon Graham at the time gave him the task to formulate the general operational requirement for what became the FX program, and that evolved into the F-15 Eagle air superiority fighter. And to Al's point, during that period, Gordy Graham yelled across the hallway one time, "Send earthquake over here." And that spontaneous reference stuck. That became Bob Titus's call sign. He never did like it much, but it was definitely appropriate for a guy anybody that knew that deep voice brash officer.
Yep.
So he continued to advance rapidly through the ranks and commanded various units. And eventually, when the Vietnam War started, he headed up the 10th Fighter Commando Squadron at Bien Hoa in Vietnam. They were called the Scotia Tigers. They flew the F-5 Freedom Fighter before those airplanes were turned over to the South Vietnamese. He flew 350 air combat missions in that airplane, and he did admit that he somehow forgot to log maybe 50 more missions. So we don't know exactly how many he did fly. And in January 67, he took command of an F-4C Phantom Squadron at Da Nang Air Base in South Vietnam, and he kind of whipped that outfit into shape, and that's when they were starting to fly north into North Vietnam. And some pretty good stories there, but he eventually shot down 3 MiG-21 fighters within 2 days. And the one he got first day got him a Silver Star, and then downing 2 MiGs 2 days later, he was awarded the Air Force Cross. Then he came back to the States and was assigned to Air Force headquarters and put in charge of the F-15 program. So he and some stellar guys actually put together what became the Eagle, the F-15 Eagle program, and brought it into the inventory. During that time, we talk about in the book about the so-called gunfights that he had to go through, because he, having shot down 1 MiG with a 20 millimeter cannon in a gun pod mounted on the center line of his Phantom, he knew very well the value of a cannon or a gun in these fighters. But at the time, senior leadership in the Air Force was convinced you didn't need a gun. All you needed was missiles. But he fought long and
Yep.
hard and managed to get the gun, 20 millimeter cannon, mounted internal to the F-15. However, those gunfights probably cost him a couple of stars because he irritated the wrong people. But he always smiled and he would say, yeah, but every Air Force fighter since the 70s has had a gun in it. So he later
Thankfully.
commanded the 18th Tactical Fighter Wing in Okinawa, which Tom can talk about, served any number of staff assignments, received 1 star, and then he retired as a brigadier general in 1977. He continued to serve, though, because he mentored and sponsored just any number of Air Force Academy cadets, particularly any number of them that played on the football team there. And they all learned from him how to lead by example. And he, as one of the Air Force's preeminent commanders, was the right guy to do exactly that. Unfortunately, we lost Earthquake Titus just recently on September 8th. He flew west and left quite a legacy. Over to you, Al and Tom.
Well, indeed he did, and Tom I know flew with him. Tom, I think you started out with him in 104s. Is that right?
No, I was in a 104 squadron during the Berlin crisis when Earthquake was the ops officer of the 53rd Squadron at Bitburg, and I was over at Han, TDY. And Earthquake, as I recall, was never in a 104 squadron. He just tested them at Edwards. He
Yeah.
tested everything at Edwards, and he was a legend in his lifetime. Uh, I was telling Earthquake, Earthquake, the first time I met you, you were the ops officer of the 53rd Squadron at Bitburg. And the wing commander there was a chap by the name of General Bob Delishaw, big brigadier general. In my 104 squadron, his nephew was my flight commander, Tom Delishaw, and really taught me so many things as a young fighter pilot because the 104s were my first squadron, operational squadron. I went through F-100s after flying school. But that's the first time I met Earthquake. The 105s were the only thuds, as we call them, in Europe at the time. So it was brand new. They were D
Mhm.
models, and he played a major role in their development. Uh, my next run-in with Earthquake was when he became the commander of the Scotia Tigers, and that was bringing the F-5s over to Vietnam. Now, I'd come back from my first tour in Vietnam in '64, going from 104s to a forward air controller in Vietnam, '63 to '64, and I was in the first F-4 fighter weapons, well, first F-4 wing, except I was in a detachment up at Eglin Air Force Base, testing the F-4 and dropping bombs and doing all the early testing in the
Uh-huh.
F-4Cs. Bob brought his group in, and they were doing the test of the F-5, and uh, he was using our squadron as a as an administrative facility, and so I got to know him a lot better and the work that he was doing. I subsequently went from the F-4C squadron to the weapons school at Nellis, the first F-4 weapons school, and then I stayed on as an instructor. So I left Eglin and doing the testing, and that's where I ran into Bob again. But he was now developing the FX, as we called it in those days, uh, and I was the F4D Category 3 project officer, and then the F4E Category 3, which was the first F4 that had an internal gun. Now, the connection was I was a strong proponent, but Bob by then was a full colonel, I think. No, he was still a lieutenant colonel in the
Okay.
Pentagon, uh, and uh, and he was pushing on the F-15 to have an internal gun, and so we were putting it in the F-4, and I'd get a lot of visitors, the studies and analysis people from the Pentagon that would come out, and they would, ask us young fighter pilots. I was a captain, uh, what we thought about it, and of course, I was a very strong proponent. Then the interesting thing was, Bob made the selection of the F-15, and he went. I got to think of the timing. He'd gone back. He'd gone back to Southeast Asia with these Scotia Tigers, the F5, and then he went up to, as Bill said, went up to Da Nang. He was flying the F5s out of Benoit. Then he went up to Da Nang and took over an F4E squadron. They had E's there, and I'm pretty sure they were E's. No, they were not. They had not yet gotten the E yet, because I
We
know I brought the
probably
first
D's.
E's into. They were D's, and I'd done the D test. But the important thing was I flew with Bob's squadron, and one of his weapons officer was a chap by the name of Bob Dilger, and Bob had been a student of mine at Nellis in the weapons school, and I was over there TDY. Nellis would keep a chap in Europe and in Vietnam all the time, Southeast Asia, keeping up to date on the latest tactics. And they'd feed him
Mhm.
back to Nellis. And I was
Sure.
on one of those tours. I had two of those tours, uh, in addition to the one I had. And then I went back for a fourth tour on my own in the first F4E squadron that I'd done the testing at Karat. But in any case, uh, Dilge was a very aggressive guy, and so I was flying with him. And he said, "Tom, I want to go into Route Package 6, which was the Hanoi area, Hanoi Haiphong area."
Yep.
and we'll go in low level in the daytime.
Oh.
And of course, I was, you know, a little bit stunned by it, but I was a fighter
I can
pilot and he was doing some tactics over there. I wanted to be part of it. I said, okay, Dilge.
imagine.
But the word got out to Earthquake. They didn't call him Earthquake in the squadron in those days
I can
because
imagine
they didn't
why.
let us use. No, we didn't use call signs in those days. Bill
Yeah,
Creech
we
didn't
didn't.
like 'em. So Earthquake found out about it, and Earthquake said, "No, you're not going to do that." And we, of course, saluted, "Yes, sir, we're not going to do that." I believe because we did not do that, I am still here. Now, I've had a lot of problems between
Great.
then and, but I would not have made it through that tour in the daylight in route package 6, no matter how fast you were going. There was
So he
just too
saved
much
your
lead
life
they'd
then.
throw up in the air. He saved my
So
life.
he saved you.
He
Yeah.
saved my life. And Bill put that particular story in his book on Earthquake, but I'm immensely grateful to him for it. But he was an extraordinary commander. And
Yep.
when actually when he returned from being squadron commander there, and with the three MiGs, is when they sent him to the Pentagon and assigned him as a source selection for the FX. And he had Gary Willard and a bunch of outstanding fighter pilots.
Hmm.
You may have remembered Gary
Yes, indeed.
Al because he started the Wild Weasel for the U.S.
Yes.
Air Force in the F-100s,
Yep. Yep. He sure
and
did.
so Earthquake surrounded himself with good people, and they selected the F-15 McDonnell Douglas version. The biggest competitor was a version from Northrop Grumman that well, it was just Northrop in those days, and Grumman hadn't bought them yet. But
Yeah.
they got the right airplane. The Northrop was a good airplane, don't misunderstand me. It was a high flyer, and it could boom out to well past Mach 2, but it didn't turn as well and didn't do the things that the F 15. So I spent a lot of time in the F 15 once it became operational. Well, because when I left Nellis, I went back to Staff College and then to the Pentagon. I was the F 15 project officer in requirements. Once they selected it and named it the F 15, it hadn't flown. I was working on it. They dispersed. Earthquake went to National War College and then on to bigger jobs. But so I got involved with the F 15 before it flew, and then I first flight, and then I got assigned to Luke as a 104 F5 DO. I had German students for F4s. Then I had a lot of Saudis and the like for F5s over at Willie. And then I went to the Pentagon and I became the F 15 project officer. No, excuse me. Uh, uh, I'd already had that job, but I got to fly the F 15
Hmm.
when I was in London once it flew. And I went from Luke to London as the air attaché, and I left Luke 3 months before the F-15s came in for the first base for F-15s, which disappointed me, but I wasn't given a choice. The chief of staff fired the air attaché, and so they, I got selected to go. But the beauty was at Farnborough, they brought the F-15s over, and the test pilots knew me, and so I got to fly the F-15 in England. Uh, and excuse me, uh, the uh, which was a great experience. because then the chief of the air staff, Sir Andrew Humphrey, I went back to the United States with him, and he visited all of the chief and all the 4 stars. And he was the last chief of air staff to fly the Comet. You may all remember the Comet was the first passenger jet, and the RAF still was flying it for the chief of air staff. So I flew around the United States, over and around the United States in a British Comet with chief of the air staff. And of course, I was telling him a lot about the F-15 because I was bound and determined to sell the F-15 to the Royal Air Force. And Sir Andrew and I got along very well because when we came back from that trip, he said, "All right, Tom, I want you to fly every fighter the Royal Air Force has, every airplane the Royal Air Force has." Of course, I went through all the fighters, but I wasn't much for the airlift. No, no offense, but
You get to
so I
fly
got to
the
fly.
Vulcan?
I turned the Vulcan down, and I turned it down because they wouldn't let me go to the pilot seat. Well, it turns out the Vulcan wasn't like most bombers. It didn't have a pilot co-pilot seat. It only had a pilot seat. And so they were not going to let me fly in that seat and be the only one in control of the airplane. I should have done it because the
So you
Vulcan is
told him,
just a fantastic airplane.
oh yeah, so you
Uh,
told him forget that one, right?
yeah, but I got the P-1 Lightning, and you may have
Uh,
remembered that. That had the engines one on top of another. It,
yes.
it stayed up less time than a 104, but boy, did it have smash. And it
All
could
right.
boom off, and great airplane. But in any case, so Earthquake had established for me some very vital things. I came back and went to, was a wing commander in the Philippines and took the air division over in Okinawa that Bob had had. They'd converted the wing to an air division. I had a wing underneath me, but that was a marvelous assignment. We had F-15s then, so
Yep.
I got a lot of F-15 time there. And I remember the last flight out, well, I got promoted to 2 stars out of there, and so I went back as the DCS operations and intel for PACAF, Pacific Air Forces. I launched 55 F-15s, come out at 4 squadrons, the squadron commanders leading each one of their squadrons. And the first time anybody said anything was when we came back. We went out and we did had a wall of eagles, 55 eagles coming across the training area. We're using our F4s as targets, and it was beautiful to do. Took them all out, and then headed home. And in the break, I was blue lead. I said, "Blue lead, gear down and check." And that was the first time we talked. Now, the reason I point this out was because I didn't care what the pilot's last name was, where he went to school, who he was married to, who his mommy and daddy were, any of
Yep.
that. Everything was based on merit. And you're talking a single seat fighter, which I grew up in most of the time, except all the F4 time and the 111 time I had. But we now are facing, and with STARS is doing a magnificent job, we are now facing critical race theory and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these are Marxist ideologies. Now, Bill, we are faced with something I never thought could happen. Now, of course, I went through my career in the Air Force and ended up in Washington and got in television by accident because of a nonprofit I'm only saying this because when 9/11 happened, I then ended up working for Fox News for 16 and a half years. But my
Yes.
point is, uh, I never thought anybody could penetrate the U.S. military. They have. I just never believed it could happen. And I was going before COVID-19 into the Pentagon 4 days a week because I had
Hmm.
a run an edge cloud company, and we can ingest every sensor on the battle space. Now it's changed in our day because you've got all these UAVs. They're pumping lots of data back in. You got the F-35 is our most fantastic sensor, and the guys at Langley still haven't figured it out. What they don't really want is the A2 running the air tasking order, the frag. But because the F-35 ingests every sensor it sees. But when you fuse all this data, and my pod, we had a pod over in Bagram, and we were ingesting from a UAV. Uh, and the normal UAVs, as you know, is got a very narrow field of view, maybe
Hmm. Yeah.
50 yards depending on your altitude, maybe 30 depending on your altitude. This had 8 kilometers, so it is ingesting far more data.
Sure.
And they would land it. And the reason I'm getting into this is because we have got a military that is changing. But I was heavily involved up till COVID-19 with the military. I still am, but I'm not in the Pentagon 4 days a week. And I know that earthquake, I have I have gotten very aggressive. I do 4 radio shows a week. I don't do Fox News uh, anymore because they fired me. And they fired me because I called John McCain Songbird John. They really wanted to fire me because I was one of the first general officers to support President Trump. And so for those years, uh, when they'd introduce me, they'd say that. And as it turns out, I don't want to get into it too much now, but the fact is, I've been heavily involved with this critical race theory, with DEI, what it's doing to our military, what has happened to our nation. And
Right.
STARS has been an absolute superb leader in trying to turn this around and get the Air Force Academy. I'm involved with the Lincoln Group
Uh-huh.
for West Point, and there's a Calvert Group for Annapolis. But they are trying to change our military. They're trying to change our country.
They indeed are, General, and we're so happy to have you on our side on that argument because it is one that we're facing today, as you say. We didn't have when we were younger, going out and flying every day. You know, I remember my biggest concern was, am I going to get enough sleep here before I have to turn around and go back and fly over the north again? And as you know, getting up every day to do that, you can't be weak, you can't have doubts, you can't hesitate, you can't not be there, and also you can't not be really good at what you do, right? And I
Correct.
worry that we're losing some of that now. And if we're not careful, that's a very delicate commodity to have today. So what do you think? What do you think, both of you? What do you think Earthquake would say if he was faced with that today?
Well, he'd say the
I can
same
say,
thing that I'm saying,
Well, that's
but
and I
well,
Bill
we're on
can
the
tell
same
you what
page
he'll
then.
say.
yeah, we talked about that a lot when I was doing interviews with him, and he obviously had absolutely no patience with DEI whatsoever. He saw it as a very big cancer, as Tom said, in the military. It's literally rotting our military from the inside out. And of course, it is really hampering recruitment because a lot of guys don't want to join a military that's all about gender, color, and having the right narrative at your fingertips. And as my son, who Tom also was a West Point graduate, years before we even heard DEI, he said, "Dad, I don't want to go to war with these guys." And how many other young men and women feel the same way now? And Al, I bet you can tell me, Tom, you can too, that you've run into any number of veterans and probably active duty people too that said, I am now warning my own children to not go into the military. And these were guys that served 20 and 30 years and were diehard patriots. But none of them really feel comfortable with the attitudes and leadership in almost all of our military services. I might make an exception for the Marines right now because they seem to be the one that has
Yes.
resisted the DEI the most. Over to you, Tom.
Well, I never talked to Earthquake about this because I'm passionate about the issue, and I don't like to. And with the time I had left with Earthquake since this has started, it just never presented itself. But I'm on the radio four days a week, talking to everybody. I just did a radio show talking about the second assassination of President Trump attempt. And all of this is related. And I don't want to get back into those sides. I want to keep it focused on the STARS side, on the military side. But none
Great.
of what is happening is by accident. And President Trump, when he comes back in, and God, if he doesn't come back in, we're finished as a nation. Uh, if if all the chiefs are going to have to go, the Marine may not, but the other chiefs, which have accepted it, and the chairman are going to have to go. Now, we've never had to do this. And the only thing I do is encourage people, knowing that hopefully we're going to win this and we need good people in the military,
Yep.
Al and Bill. But we have never seen anything like this, that our greatest threat is from within. And the military was our last bastion. And
Exactly.
it's critical. And that's why what STARS is doing for us is so vitally important. We're working in the MacArthur Society and the Calvert Group, but we're nibbling at the edges. And that's why I've gone public on it. And I don't want, with General Bishop and that, get STARS to be where I am on the totality of it from the whole government. I want them to focus on the Air Force Academy, on the military side of it, keep the focus on that. But I want everybody to understand it is bigger than the military. It is being driven by Marxists in our government. And but STARS is leading the way on the service academies. And I help form, and I'm on the board of directors of the MacArthur Society. And the
And
important thing is,
MacArthur Society is a great sister organization, along with the
it
Calvert
is,
Group. And
and
that's a battle that we're fighting every day almost these days. But one thing
it
that you
is.
mentioned earlier about us in the past, we've relied on military families particularly to be a source of our leaders, particularly our officers. Uh, and I'm no different. I'm from a 3 generation family who have all done that as aviators. And yet, when my grandsons wanted to join the military, I said, guys, need to investigate this pretty carefully because it has changed a great deal. Two of them went in, spent a couple of years, and came right back out, which disappointed me. But there are a lot of others we've had on this podcast who've had the same experience. Generations of children, grandchildren, relatives who have been associated and in the military sense as dependents, like I was, who now have decided that they can't support that anymore. That is a telling problem. And we've got, you're right, General, we've got to fix that and fix it soon. Can I mention one other thing? I had the pleasure of serving under Titus when I was in the 67th Attack Fighter Squadron. We were flying F-4 Weasels there in Okinawa at the end of the war. And so Titus sent me off to fight the end of the war in Wild Weasels. He said, "You guys got to go end this thing." Well, we did. We went over there expecting to be there for a year or 100 missions, and we ended the war and came home early, which was great. But then Titus had another task in front of him, and that was to send us right back over to Taiwan to get into defending Taiwan, who unfortunately couldn't quite as well because they'd given all those Scotia Tigers to the South Vietnamese, who promptly lost them to the North Vietnamese when we gave up over in Vietnam. So for about a year, we were over in Taiwan, standing air defense alert and defending the Taiwanese from the Chinese. And here we are right back again in a major, almost conflict that happened. But Earthquake through it all was great with that. He supported us. He took care of his people, and it worked out really well. And it wouldn't have happened, I don't think, without his great leadership.
No, and he understood it. When I took the wing over at Clark, we still had nuclear forces out of my wing up at CCK. And
Yep.
then we moved those forces out. But I had an air defense identification
Yep.
zone, ADIZ responsibility as the wing commander at Clark. And my boss, the 13th Air Force commander, had had that overall responsibility, but I had the assets. And but that's what's changed for us, and that's why what you're doing now, Al, with stars, is so very very important. Uh, and I've been a strong supporter of Rod Bishop and the whole team. You guys have done a
Great.
fantastic job, and I got the MacArthur Society to use stars as the model when we started out. And so that's why what you're doing is so critically important. This election is going to determine that. This
Oh,
election is
yes.
going to determine which way we're going to go as a nation. Now,
But,
I believe the
and people,
divine Lord is behind us because that's the only thing that saved President Trump. If you measure the distance between your ear and your head and a bullet goes through there, you know that it wasn't looking at the view graph that did that. The, Once that happened, the dear Lord, and Bob was a very devout guy, he
yep.
knows, and we're going to need his help because I've gotten very involved with how the election was done using cyber warfare and all those things. And so,
So, so as Bob Titus, I think, would remind all of us, and it was true when we were younger, the services were totally apolitical. I mean, I didn't have a political
correct.
bone in my body when I was flying, and if I would have, I imagine Titus would have got me doing something else. Uh, but uh, but today, you're right. The challenges that we face in the military, particularly, are not so much political as they are ideological. And around here in Stars, we don't want to talk candidates and parties, but we do talk about the threats of ideologies, particularly those that are as corrosive as the ones we're facing today. And General, you're absolutely right. We need to fight that and do it hard right now before it gets out of control.
They're
I did have a
Marxists.
chance to see General Titus in action back on April 25th. We had what we call a heritage moment at the Air Force Academy, and it was
Yeah,
designed to honor General Titus. So all of the firsties, the graduating cadets, class of 2024, came to the Arnold Hall Theater I was on stage with Earthquake. I introduced him, gave a little 2-minute overview of his career, turned it over to him. And General Jack Catton, who was sort of the moderator, had asked me to set up and then ask General Titus, when I turned it over to him, how about telling us about shooting down those MiGs? Well, he ignored that and went ahead and spoke to the cadets, and it was brilliant. And it was all about duty, honor, mission, which is what he stood for his entire life.
Yes.
And as we were coming towards the end of that, Catton introduced one more time, said, well, please tell the cadets about shooting down those MiGs. And Bob just kind of bellowed to the whole theater, says, well, when I got that first one, I just yelled, I got that son of a bitch. And the whole place erupted in this massive hoorah. And the cadets absolutely loved it.
Oh, yeah.
Then we did a book signing right after that, and at least 100, probably more than 100 cadets lined up, stood there in line for sometimes up to 2 hours while Bob and I signed copies of the books, because when those cadets went into the theater, we gave them 1,025 copies gratis of the Earthquake book, thanks to people like Tom McInerney and a few others that donated to make that happen. Well, Bob and I felt, that those kids that stood in line for that long, those were the leaders of tomorrow, because every single one of them thanked him for being there, and they were very respectful. A lot of them didn't show up, of course. And the few cadets that I was able to say, what do you think about this DEI stuff? The best they could do was roll their eyes and just kind of gently shake their head. They knew what it took to get through and graduate. But I'm telling you, there's a few others, probably a lot of others, that are being indoctrinated, and they're eating this stuff up. So thank God for STARS working on it. But I would say the academies, Tom, you may agree, from the MacArthur Society side of things, they're going to be a real challenge.
Well, we're busy, as you say, Bill, fighting that all the time, and particularly now. That fight goes on. STARS is still looking for people who want to help us with that, and those watching this podcast can help with that. We're looking for volunteers. We're looking for folks who may want to help us with donations. They can go to our website and take care of that there. There's an avenue to do that. But we're organized, and our function is to now educate people and go to action. And it's time for a call to action. And that's part of what this podcast is about. And my thanks to the both of you, Bill Scott and General McInerney, for being with us today to reinforce that message to the folks who might be listening to this. Our numbers are growing on the podcast. We're happy about that, but we got a whole lot of work still to do here. And I'm so glad to have had both of you with us today to talk to our STARS audience about that. And thanks again for being with us, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us, Al.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. And we'll see you maybe in another time here. We will have more time and more room to talk about the things that we went over today. And thanks again. And to our audience, this is Commander Al Palmer, retired. I'm going to sign off and leave you with this one thought. Today is Constitution Day. Do what you can do, as we have all done, in raising our hands to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And we'll see you for another episode next week.